Johnson. And as LJ mentioned, President Johnson is one of those presidents who's known by his initials. So JFK, three initial dude, right? Lyndon Johnson is our second president named Johnson. So if you ever have a question about President Johnson, they both came after slain presidents, right? Both President Kennedy and President Lincoln, you know, but very, very different in terms of political philosophy and attitudes. So LBJ is from Texas, and he was born at low income. Now, not nearly as low income as Andrew Johnson, but he was from a sort of rural, out of this community of Austin Hill country that is known for its populism. So liberal in some respects out the gate, you know, saw government as a solution to your problems kind of thing. He had been somewhat reluctant on the topic of civil rights. You really weren't going to get elected to the U.S. Senate from Texas if you were openly endorsing civil rights. So early on in his career, that was not a major issue for him as far as campaigning. Now, he cared deeply about African Americans, but you're not going to get elected president talking about, or elected senator talking about it. Now, I do want you to pay attention to what his role was in the U.S. Senate. He was the Senate Majority Leader, which is the most powerful senator in the Senate. And they're sort of like the Speaker of the House, but they have some even more authority than that. So he was a very powerful senator, and he steered a lot of money to Texas. Remember, the Johnson Space Center is in Texas because of him. So LBJ was a career politician. You'll see here he started out as a young man working in a congressional office during the New Deal, right? So he was employed by a congressman. Then he ran for Congress and was elected. He lost his first bid for the U.S. Senate, and then when he got elected later, he never got beaten again. And he was put on the ticket with Kennedy primarily to woo Southern voters, okay? Because he's from Texas and he talks like a Southerner, sounds like, I mean, you know, he was very, very folksy, kind of like Harry Truman, you know, like not polished. And that for a lot of people has a lot of appeal, you know, it doesn't sound too scripted, so to speak. One of the most famous thing about, or infamous, depending on who you asked, about Johnson is the so-called Johnson treatment, okay? The Johnson treatment. So what is that? Well, you know, if it weren't a pandemic, I might do a Johnson treatment right in here. But what Johnson was a big guy, 6'3", and of course back then that's even bigger, you know, and he would use his physicality to actually get in your space. He would like personally violate your personal space, and he would really kind of pressure people almost like a physical bully. Here you can see him speaking to Sam Rayburn. He's like leaning into Rayburn, almost looks like he's getting ready to give him a kiss, right? So he is almost nose to nose with these other politicians. And he would call up on the telephone and talk to you. And I can't avoid one of my all-time favorite recordings. So Johnson was the man who installed the recording system in the White House. Nixon's going to be the one who pays the price for this, but Johnson was actually the one who started recording every phone call and conversation in the White House. And he did this so he could blackmail people or twist, like later on, be like, yeah, I got you on tape. And so Johnson would have his advisors, for example, stand by the Oval Office bathroom, and he would leave the door open while he was using the bathroom, you know, like number two, and be talking to them. And they'd be all flustered. He would go skinny dipping in the White House pool and bring in the White House press corps. So his whole way of, and by the way, the closest president I can compare to Johnson in terms of like throwing people off their balance is Donald Trump. Trump and Johnson had similar leadership styles, which we actually call adversarial, meaning he would pit his own employees against each other to try to get their best work out of, you know, like to overcome, you know, to be the best. But he would also embarrass you and humiliate you if he felt like that was what he wanted to do. So I've got a recording. I don't have a recording. This is part of the White House taping system that I want to play for you guys. Let me get this up here for you. And it is really it's a perfect example to talk about what kind of dude LBJ was. And it's called the pants recording. Okay. So this is LBJ ordering pants. And first of all, the fact that the president of the United States from the Oval Office is ordering pants should tell you alone, he's not that high and mighty, right? Like LBJ is down to earth as it gets. And maybe some would consider him too earthy, you know, because you're going to want to hear this. And I think this is the recording that I want you to hear. So let's check this out and see what we think. Okay. LBJ ordering pants.
Hello? Hello. Mr. Hager?
Yes, this is Joe Hager.
Oh.
Joe, is your father the one that makes clothes?
Yes, sir. We're all together.
You all made me some real lightweight slacks that he just made up on his own, sent to me 3 or 4 months ago. It's a kind of a light brown and a light green, rather soft green and soft brown.
Yes, sir.
Now, I need about 6 pairs for summer wear.
Yes, sir.
I need about 6 pairs to wear around in the evening when I come in from work.
Yes, sir.
And I can send you a pair. I want them a ½ inch larger in the waist than they were before, except I want 2 or 3 inches of stuff left back in there so I can take them up. I vary 10 to 15 pounds a month.
All right, sir.
So leave me at least 2.5 to 3 inches in the back where I can let them out or take them up, and make these a ½ inch bigger in the waist. Make the pockets at least 1 inch longer. My money and my knife and everything fall out. Wait just a minute. Hello?
Hello.
Now, another thing, the crotch down where your nuts hang is always a little too tight. So when you make them up, give me 1 inch that I can let out there, because they cut me. They're just like riding a wire fence. These are the best that I've had anywhere in the United States.
Right.
But when I gain a little weight, they cut me under there. So leave me, you never do have much margin there. Let's see if you can't leave me about 1 inch from where the zipper ends, round under my, back to my bunghole.
All right, sir.
So I can let it out there if I need to.
Back to my bunghole.
Now, be sure you got the best zippers in them. These are good that I have. And if you get those to me, I would sure be grateful.
Where would you like to send, please?
White House? I just sure will appreciate this. I need it more than anything. And now, you give this boy the address, because I'm running for a funeral, and give him address just how to dress these trousers. So we'll send them to you. And don't you get the measurements out of them and add a ½ inch to the back, give us 1 inch to the pockets, and about 1 inch underneath so we can let them out.
In other words, you like just a little more stride in the crotch.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, sir.
Okay, here he is.
Glad that you enjoyed the other.
Okay, go ahead, please.
All right. So when that recording came out, we history types absolutely loved it because it really capitalizes in that moment so many things about President Johnson. So you have his sort of crudeness, right? Like you're talking about his crotch and his bunghole, like riding a wire. Cut me. And in the midst of this conversation, he rips a burnt right in the guy's ear, right? So you think you're listening to this good old boy, and he's president of the United States, right? So that was part of Johnson's allure in some respects, was that he was very down to earth. He had a really nice, pretty wife, Lady Bird. And a lot of people initially were really fond of President Johnson. He started out fairly popular. That's him showing off through the press his appendix scar, where he had appendicitis and had his appendix removed. If you watch the movie Forrest Gump, Forrest says, "I was shot in the buttocks," and Johnson says, "Oh, I'd like to see that in the movie." And so Forrest turns around and moons Johnson, and Johnson's laughing. The beauty of original CGI, right? He loved his dogs. You can see him over here howling with his dog. Now, the picture back down in the bottom right, he actually got in trouble from the SPCA, because he's like holding this beagle up by the ears. But Johnson loved his dogs very much. He had a ranch in Texas that, if you were special enough, he would take you down there for like a cookout, Texan style. And then he'd give you a ride in he had a convertible Cadillac that he rode around the ranch in at full speed. And sometimes he would go flying on this Cadillac, right? And he would be headed straight for the lake that was on his property. And then he would drive straight into the lake at full speed. And it would, people would be screaming, right? And they'd be like, how can you, and then he would joke with them and turn the propeller on the car. And this is it. I wanted to show y'all his car. This car would turn into a boat. So he had a transformer, and here it is, LBJ's car boat. an amphibious car. And he would love to prank people who didn't know any better. He would drive this thing in, and they would think that it was just the end of the world. Like they were getting ready to get drowned by the president. And then he'd take off across the lake in his car. So that was all part of his style. He was he was a good guy, but he was definitely different from the Kennedys. I'll put it that way. Very different from the Harvards. And so he comes in, and right away he's confronted with the last major speech that Kennedy gave. So if you remember, Kennedy's last major speech was on the topic of civil rights, right? And Martin Luther King was pressing President Johnson to move forward on this. And Johnson really was tortured about it a little bit because he understood the importance of a new Civil Rights Act, but he also understood, this is kind of his first action as president. What is he going to do? But he decided to start browbeating the Southern senators, and there would be a filibuster of this bill. Here's Strom Thurmond. Remember him? He's going to have the longest filibuster in history, but they're finally going to reach cloture and vote to pass the Civil Rights Act. And so, but folks, this is by far the most significant bill passed in the civil rights period, in the civil rights era. This is the act of Congress that is still in effect, by the way. The Civil Rights Act still applies to U.S. businesses today, that if you are engaged in interstate commerce or any kind of business with the government, you cannot discriminate based on race. So this outlaws, for all intents and purposes, Jim Crow. This outlaws segregation. Now, it's interesting about the Civil Rights Act is it's telling the public businesses that are open to the public, you can't discriminate in busing, in housing, in restaurants, in lunch counters, all the things that have been segregated that the Freedom Riders and Dr. King have been protesting for. Well, that's in the Civil Rights Bill. And it is just a monumentally important law. The first pen he uses a pen per letter of his name, right? That's common for presidents on a big bill. They call these signing ceremonies. The very first pen that he uses, he gives to Dr. King, and so they have this good working relationship, and LBJ is pleased that there's such support for this act. So please, again, the Civil Rights Act. And at the core of it is it prohibits segregation. So, this had been coming, but it had been incremental. And now you cannot segregate in any facility, basically, that engages in interstate commerce. The Civil Rights Act is expanded to cover gender. You might notice that's also going to be a factor in it. They include gender. It's not in there, but I'm telling you that's a fact. Part of the Civil Rights Act is a part called Title IX that prohibits bias or discrimination in publicly funded athletic events. So today, if you have a male sport at your institution, you have to have an equivalent female sport in your institution. So you can't discriminate based on that either, the gender. But definitely a hugely successful bill. And this tells you how much clout Johnson has, because what Johnson is going to say is, are you not going to vote? Is your vote going to get in the way of our slain president? Are you going to vote against dead Kennedy, literally? And he'd say, we're not crucify you, but we're going to destroy you in the fall if you do that. If you vote that way, talking to Democrats and to moderate Republicans. And so he definitely strong arms this bill through, but that's kind of what has to happen sometime to get laws passed with Congress. So the Civil Rights Act is a hugely significant law. And it's, like I said, it's still in effect today. You can definitely see what all that did. Now, not only did Johnson want to, continue to add to the rights of African Americans guarantees, he wanted to be a president for those that were least fortunate, those that were most underrepresented. And so he believed that one of the greatest ways to expand democracy, freedom, and also to gain political support was to go to war on poverty. And this came out as a result of this book called The Culture of Poverty, was one of these exposés, kind of like How the Other Half Lives. So keep in mind, in the affluent 50s, most people are kind of feeling comfortable, right? And then out comes this book that says there are millions of people, 32 million people in America who are in poverty, right? And so how can we brag about being the richest, wealthiest country when 20% of our country is in poverty? And so Johnson is going to create a huge agenda to go to war on poverty. Okay. And notice what he includes in there. This is what poverty produces, y'all. Bad health, poor housing. People don't aspire. Do you understand what that means? Later on, go ahead. That's right. No dreams or goals. It's just survival, you know. Later on, President Bush, who I usually disagree with just about everything on in terms of education, he did say one line that I love, and I've always kind of kept it to memory. And he said that when we're talking about education, one of the things that is just as harmful as like racism is the soft bigotry of low expectations. You understand? Where when you have poor people of marginalized society, thus the teacher doesn't expect anything from them, and thus they don't ever achieve anything, you know. And I think there's a lot of truth to it, not because of their race, not because of the color of their skin, but because of poverty, right? And so the war on poverty is designed to try to elevate people out of that standing, okay? And what LBJ created would become one of the most famous and later on in history criticized, depending on who you asked, public programs in the history of our country. So right up there with the New Deal. Now remember, LBJ was a New Dealer. You know, that was just, he talked about FDR being his political granddaddy. And so this is called the Great Society. So, you know, if you had to write about presidential agendas, be they Square Deal or New Freedom or New Deal or Fair Deal, this is the Great Society, which is the biggest expansion of government role in you know, the welfare of the public since the New Deal. And he wants to you know, spread the wealth. And does America have a lot of wealth in the early 60s? Yeah, absolutely. You know, this is kind of one of those things where he wants to put a lot of things out there for to improve the public. And so in the area of healthcare, he has healthcare for the elderly. Okay, that's Medicare. So you should know the distinction between these groups or these policies. So he has Medicare, which is healthcare insurance basically for the elderly, healthcare for the elderly, and Medicaid, which is for low income. So if you are a low income person, you qualify for Medicaid. If you are elderly, you qualify for Medicare. And if you're both, well, then you qualify for both. Okay. So that's still in effect today. The Head Start is pre-K education for low income. HUD is the Federal Housing and Urban Development. That's a cabinet level agency. So this is government housing. A Job Corps to be sort of a domestic version of the Peace Corps, right? Domestic Peace Corps. And then these other laws, you can kind of probably figure out. Water Quality and Clean Air Act, well, what they did, and Highway Safety Act, what it did. So, you know, lots and lots of government expansion here for the, you know, the argument is for the general welfare of the American people. Okay. So Medicare, Medicaid are probably the two biggest programs that come out of this. And of course, HUD as well. Now, when he talks about aid to education, he's also going to expand things like college tuition assistance. Yeah, you know, the Pell Grant will emerge during this period. And lots of federal money to education during this time period too. So I didn't mention another component of this, which I probably need to, and that is the end to the national origin system. So let me fix that real quick. The end to the national origin system. So expand this. Sorry, give me just a second. Get out of my sight. Well, up until this period in history, we are still working on the national origin system, which, you know, means that immigration was relatively low during all this period. And so you're going to have the end of that and a new immigration bill, particularly with a component called family unification. So if you had a family member who was in the United States, you are allowed entry into this country. And so we're going to call this a liberal expansion of a lot of things, you know, a liberal expansion of government role in housing and liberal expansion of immigration policy. So you're going to have a lot of growth. And by the way, when I talk about American liberalism, it is overwhelmingly the product of President Roosevelt, FDR Roosevelt, and President Johnson, LBJ. These are the two sort of titans of modern liberalism. And by that, the liberalism of of not so much Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith, but the liberalism of John Stuart Mill, modern industrial society liberalism. Okay. And one of the things this creates as a result of this is a massive entitlement system that emerges. So what are entitlements in America by definition? Anybody here know the word entitled? People bristle at hearing that word, but that is the definition. So what are entitlements? Nobody knows? Things the government owes you. That's pretty much the best way to describe it. In other words, guaranteed by law that you will receive these things. So today, by far the largest entitlement is Social Security, followed closely behind by Medicare and then Medicaid. So if you're looking at the federal budget today, so the definition of entitlement is, actually, I got a better one here. This one looks a lot better. It's a little bit old, dated, but it totally works for the present. Where the money goes, right? So when we have this massive budget, a huge chunk of it today, almost $1 trillion today, goes to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So you can see that's $2 trillion in a year just to 3 entitlements, right? So and guys, seniors don't like to hear them called entitlements. They're like, I don't like that word, because they think that it means like some sort of, I don't know, being entitled, right? But the definition of entitlement that we're working off of here is the right to benefits that you've been guaranteed by the government, by law. So right to benefits guaranteed by law. And so what happens is that people don't recognize that's the term for it unless they study it, like I have so much. But if we go to try to fix Social Security and Medicare today, people get really upset because they're like, hey, wait a minute now, I have the right to this stuff, all right? And that's a fair argument. So the future of Medicare and Social Security are at risk in the long term because people in the short term don't want to accept any changes. But at the time, these are going to be enormously successful at helping to bring Americans out of poverty. So let me show you poverty stats before and after the Great Society. Poverty rate before and after the Great Society. So here's some chart data. It will show you how it will drop dramatically during these programs. So if you're looking at the orange, let's see here. Let's go back to this. What most of these programs were designed to be for, by the way, or who these programs were designed to be for, were seniors and children. Seniors and children. And if you look here, you can see that that's a dramatic reduction, right? And that then creates one of the great difficulties of analyzing President Johnson, because under him, poverty reduced by almost 25%, right? There was a dramatic decrease in poverty. Here's another set of graphics from, is this Pew? I forget which site this is, but another way to look at it is just look at the dramatic decline right during his presidency, right? So huge impact this has on poverty. Of course, it comes at a huge cost, and that therein lies the debate about, is this stuff worth it? Because I think it probably would not have created the great sort of anger and stuff like that that's going to have later in history, particularly President Johnson, if it weren't for his decision to do what scholars call today guns and butter, right? So it's the guns and butter curve. So what does guns and butter mean? And you should write this down since it doesn't make it in your textbook. But if you had an essay on LBJ, you would want to be familiar with this. So guns and butter. Now here's a later joke, a cartoon making fun of President Trump and guns and butter. But what guns and butter means is paying for war, guns, and paying for social spending, butter. So President Johnson's going to pay for the Great Society. They're going to cut taxes and balance the budget under Johnson. He's going to balance the budget twice, right? Initially, this is going to be seen as a huge success. So we can afford to do this. That's butter, right? But what other conflict is going to escalate and dramatically dwarf the Great Society is the war in Vietnam. And so, unfortunately, I think for history, certainly, this guns and butter is not sustainable. You cannot pay $20 and $30 billion annually on warfare and $30 billion a year then on the Great Society. Like, we ran out of money doing that. And that means we're going to see a lot of inflation result at the end of at the start of President Nixon's presidency. You're going to see a terrible effect because both guns and butter are government spending, right? So we're pouring tons of federal dollars into the economy, and that will expand the monetary supply, right? At a time when, we'll look at the inflation later. So be aware that President Johnson's critics, certainly then and much more later, will call this guns and butter as opposed to guns or butter. That's kind of the historically, it's like President Trump, I would have said, okay, if you're going to cut taxes, what big programs are you going to cut, right? Because you're cutting, the amount of money coming in, that means you should cut the amount of money. No. So back then, conservative Republicans would say that's bad. You have to cut spending to match tax cuts. Or if you're going to increase spending, what do you have to do? And Johnson didn't. He wanted to be popular, right? He didn't want to raise taxes, so he doesn't. And that then means that you have this huge deficit swell. Now, I want to point out that Johnson is going to get some support, and this will probably be about the last time this group is significant in history. Throughout the 20th century, there had been, and I want you to write this down too, some of this stuff doesn't make it in your textbook. It should. Because you might be asking, how did Johnson get this stuff passed through Congress, right? Like, I thought Democrats in the South wouldn't pass it. Well, they won't. But what Johnson is able to utilize is the existence of what are called then Rockefeller Republicans. Now, Nelson Rockefeller was the liberal Republican governor of New York. You can't really be governor of New York and be like a pure conservative. It's not going to happen. So he was a moderate to liberal on social policy and conservative on foreign policy. That's what a Rockefeller Republican was. All right. So sort of the Southern Democrats would also share some of this, and they were called Blue Dog Democrats, right? So the idea is that you would be supportive to some degree of like the Great Society. Like Richard Nixon, by all accounts, was one of these, when he got elected. So, not strongly at all opposed to civil rights bills. Usually they voted in favor of the civil rights bill. And today, the shift in the Republican Party is so far to the right that these folks would never be elected Republican. You understand? Like today. Today, by the way, there's a kind of an acronym or a nickname for people like this now. This wasn't the term then, but they call these rhinos today. People like Rockefeller today would be called rhinos by the right. And so what is a rhino? They are a Republican in name only. Well, these weren't Republican in name only. I mean, these are old school connected to like the Lincoln era Republicans. But that's not the people in the Republican Party who are going to ultimately take it over. Today, I saw in the news just this weekend, Mitt Romney, who would, by all accounts today, be a Rockefeller Republican, a moderate Republican, right? He was heckled, by his own people in Utah this past weekend. So if you're a Republican today, you're not usually connected to this anymore. This was the end of that sort of period. By 72, those guys are pretty much, a dying breed in the Republican Party. So if you're wondering about the shift to the sort of strong conservatism of the modern Republican Party, it begins in the late 60s, particularly as a response to President Johnson, right, and the New Deal. Now, what emerged as a counter view to the Rockefeller Republicans, you got New England and Northeastern Republicans. We might call the Republican senator from Maine today, Susan Collins. She's pretty rhino-ish, and her accusers would call her that. So New England, the Northeast Republicans, well, they are going to be counterbalanced by these guys. And these are the new conservatives. They will even be called in history neo-conservative. And you need to know William F. Buckley. He is in many ways the intellectual godfather of the modern conservative movement. William F. Buckley. Now, again, these are, I think if I'm teaching Johnson, I need to teach the counterpoint that became large during his presidency. William F. Buckley had created two things that were really, really popular, one of which still exists today. So William F. Buckley was a Yale grad. He was very New Englandy in his demeanor. He was very kind of snobby seeming when you listen to him talk, but he was brilliant. And he created the conservative news magazine, the National Review. And National Review is still the sort of go-to legitimate. And when I say legitimate, I don't mean like blog or grassroots, but I mean like massive circulation and publication for conservative thinkers. And it's called National Review. And then he also created a television show, which I used to love watching, which was called Firing Line. And this was the first show I thought that did really justice to debate. So Buckley was, like I said, brilliant, and he was more than willing to debate with really smart liberals. And so he had on his show James Baldwin, for example, one of the all-time great scholars, African-American scholar of that period, a writer and thinker, and a famous person who wasn't shot, right? He had Gore Vidal. He had Noam Chomsky. So he had these like really famous liberals on his show, Firing Line, and they would debate for the public. You know, it's on TV. This was a television show, Firing Line. And it was terrific, you know, and it was smart. He was a smart conservative. And I don't mean that today's conservatives aren't smart, but there's so much more echo chamber, right? I could say the same talking point. That wasn't Buckley. Buckley was brilliant. And so between him and these strong liberal-minded people, there would be these great, I don't call them arguments, because they were really thoughtful debates. And so Buckley kind of starts, and he's not alone. There are a couple others, a guy named Irving Kristol. But by far the most famous conservative of the period was Barry Goldwater. So Barry Goldwater came from the great state of Arizona. And today he would be more aligned with the libertarians. Back then, so for example, he voted against the Civil Rights Act because he felt like it was meddling into private business as a libertarian or as a pro-free trade or free commerce person. But he wasn't overtly racist. This was not, his point of view was strongly small government conservative, right? Like no government interference in your life almost. And so here he says he was very critical of LBJ, Kennedy, Truman on foreign policy, soft on communism, right? He talked about using every weapon in our arsenal to defeat communism, okay? Here's one of his famous quotes: extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. So being strongly conservative is not a vice, all right? Moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue. So for him, his most famous book here is called The Conscience of a Conservative. He was sort of like the new type of Republican that was emerging. His most famous acolyte would be a young governor in California in the 70s named Ronald Reagan, right? And so Goldwater is going to lay the egg in 64 that Reagan is going to hatch in 80. You understand? So if you think of Ronald Reagan, think of him as a product of Barry Goldwater's activism. But he's a U.S. Senator from Arizona. And, by the way, one of the coolest campaign buttons of all time. Did you notice that? You would see people with that on their bumper sticker, AUH2O, right? Like how's that for cool? Goldwater. Okay. So he's running for president in 64. And one of the greatest lines he says is he wanted to offer America a choice, not an echo, right? A choice, not an echo, meaning I don't want to be like so many of these previous Republican candidates who just sound like a lighter version of what the Democrats are doing, right? How many times did we say in the 40s and 50s, exception of Eisenhower? Eisenhower didn't really run against anybody. But, a lot of times these as Goldwater saw them, these liberal Republicans were just an echo chamber for LBJ and the rest of the Great Society. So he runs against the Great Society. He runs against government spending. He runs against the welfare state. He runs against, government by and large. And when he makes this speech about using every weapon in our arsenal, the Democrats seize on this. And you have what's considered by most political historians the most devastating political cartoon in history. Not political cartoon, political ad in history. So the beauty of our class is we can actually go and watch this. And so it's known in history as the Daisy ad. So let's check out the Daisy ad in context of President Johnson's campaign about Barry Goldwater. So let me project that to you guys so you can see the Daisy ad. Remember, TV ads had been relatively generically bland, okay?
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd.
What?
The stakes
So,
are too high for you to stay home.
well, of course they didn't blow up the child. They just edited it together, right? But that's the idea. And so what is Johnson saying? What is the choice that we're making as a society? Happy children with me. You vote for the other guy, you get what? Nuclear annihilation, right? Because Johnson had actually mentioned, Goldwater had actually mentioned that when he said any weapon in our arsenal, we had developed what were called tactical nukes, which don't look like that, that they're like battlefield nukes. But they are going to run against Goldwater as like a nuclear fanatic. They're going to be like, this guy is going to start World War III if you elect him. His campaign had a slogan that says, in your heart, you know he's right, right? And the LBJ's campaign said, in your guts, you know he's nuts, right? So that was like this was an ugly campaign. Now that ad, this is funny, that ad only aired once, like one time. And the news channels picked it up and ran it over and over again. So it was like free ad, like free media coverage. And that actual ad has now become very much a part of the political lexicon of our history, like the Daisy ad. So it was an ugly campaign. But I'm going to tell you something. If you take a look at the outcome of the election, we knew LBJ was popular, right? And we knew that the Great Society was popular. Like one person said, nobody shoots at Santa Claus. But at the same time, we didn't know it was this popular. So I'm going to show you the election of 1964. Yeah, it's a blowout. It's not even close. So here's the election of 64's returns. Johnson absolutely crushes when it comes to, the electoral vote and the popular vote. Goldwater wins Arizona, and then take a look at where else he wins. That should be noteworthy to you. That is the Solid South, and it's now voted entirely Republican. So this is it. This is the election in history where the Solid South switches.
Is this what they call party switches?
Huh?
Is this what they call party switches?
The party switches, right? So from then on, and again, Goldwater had run strongly against the Civil Rights Act. Now, he wasn't openly racist as in terms of like, don't do this because of the end of segregation. He was against it because he thought the government didn't have the authority to say this, right? So it's very clear that now, at least the Goldwater brand of republicanism is the more states' rights, more conservative, less government solution to your problems, right? And that's an interesting switch. And it's also interesting that it's representing 6 of the states of the Sun Belt, too. Because, by the way, the South is now shifting into another classification called the Sun Belt, right? So this is the election, by the way, that Johnson says we've lost the South forever, right? Or at least for a generation. And that's true if you are, a Republican. You've won the Solid South, and they will continue. Nixon will all the way up to the present. All right, so definitely be aware of this election. Johnson wins comfortably, and he will continue his Great Society agenda. But things are going to take a dramatic turn in Southeast Asia. Why did he receive a landslide vote? Well, there's a couple different things. One is the popularity of the Great Society. It was very popular at that moment, okay? Another was the idea that he had actually run saying that he would not have a wider war in Southeast Asia, Vietnam. So by saying he would not make a wider war, it sounded like Goldwater was willing to consider invading China or bombing China. If you listen to the rhetoric that they spun, it really sounded like Goldwater was going to start World War III. And that's another reason why Johnson won, is that people thought Goldwater was dangerous, which probably an unfair accusation, but certainly. And then I would say the legacy of JFK was still very fresh in the mind of a lot of voters who turned out, and particularly black voters. A large number of black voters voted in '64. So, in the North. So that was a key component of his sort of coalition. The same people that normally voted Democrat too, the usual suspects. But I told you he ran on saying no wider war, i.e. no escalation of the war in Vietnam, right? Well, that's going to change dramatically in 64-5, in the 65 particularly. But, you know, what's in the back of LBJ's mind is the domino theory, right? And so even though this ain't Korea anymore, it's the fear that if South Vietnam becomes communist, Laos and Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, what next? You know, Malaysia, Singapore, all of that might topple to communism. So that's in Johnson's mind, right? The fear of the domino theory. And the problem is that Johnson really would say privately, routinely, I will not be the first American president who loses a war. And I think that's interesting, you know, that language. I will not lose this war. So he promised the American public, I'm not going to send American boys to do the job of Vietnamese boys, right? So he told us repeatedly that, you know, we're not going to send Americans to do the job of Southeast Asian boys. But he also said, I'm not going to be the president who sees Vietnam or Southeast Asia go the way China went. Because he knew politically how much of an albatross that was around the neck of Harry Truman, you know, the loss of China. And the Democratic Party. So here's that rhetoric of being soft on communism, you know, the Democratic Party being accused of that, coming back really to haunt us here because he wants to seem even more powerful in the wake of this. And one of the ironies of all of this is Johnson had no interest really in the war. It was all about him not wanting to lose, you know, and that really is a terrible position to be in for the American people. So something is going to happen that really changes the outcome of the election. Well, not the outcome of the election, excuse me, the outcome of the Vietnam War, excuse me. And in August of 64, we're patrolling, the U.S. Navy is patrolling the coastal waters of North Vietnam. Everybody understand that? Those coastal waters are called the Tonkin Gulf or the Gulf of Tonkin. They're away from the South China Sea and up by North Vietnam. So, you know, just try to imagine, I'll show you where the Tonkin Gulf is on a map. But we're in the midst of patrolling these waters, right? And particularly for communist vessels or for anything that's directly associated with the NBA, like carrying weapons or supplies. And on August 6th, there is a report that one of our ships, the USS Turner Joy, was targeted, or the Maddox was the first one. And so on the next day, so after this Gulf of Tonkin incident, so here's North Vietnam. You see where we are sailing around it? The next day, an operator on the USS Turner Joy claims that they were shot at. So there's communications back to America, and the Defense Department's like, can you confirm you were attacked? And the guy's like, yeah. Well, it turns out he wasn't attacked. The second attack didn't happen, but it was a mistake, right? And Johnson, after the second attack, you know, so-called by a North Vietnamese vessel on a United States vessel, goes to Congress. All right, goes to Congress and asks for authorization of forces. Here's where this is a better picture. Asks for an authorization of forces, a use of force to respond to the aggression of Vietnam or North Vietnam. So after they've attacked us, he argues twice, or he says twice, right? And so here's the Maddox on the second, and here's the Turner Joy and the Maddox claiming, but incorrectly, erroneously claiming. Johnson's going to go to Congress, and Congress is going to authorize him. Now, he's very popular at this point in a resolution of force. What that means is he can use force as much as he deems necessary. So this is the event that that we as Americans are going to consider the start of the Vietnam War, the passage of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Up before this, Americans were there as advisors, as supporters, right, of the South Vietnam. But, you know, Johnson's going to call this resolution Grandma's nightshirt. It covers everything, right? You know, so now he can do whatever he wants. Yeah, that's right. That's Johnson. He can do whatever he wants in terms of the military in Vietnam. And so President Johnson will be the first president to actually send ground forces into Vietnam. Now, I know you're like, well, I thought advisors were there. Well, they're not there as a military capacity of fighting. They're there to train, right? And the advisor that gives him the go-ahead is Robert McNamara. He's the Secretary of Defense. Remember, he's been there since Kennedy. He believes that if we send a strong message to the Vietnamese of U.S. will to fight, then the Vietnamese will back off. So if we hit them hard back, then they'll be like, oh, that's America, we better back off, right? And so know the Tonkin Gulf incident, an unprovoked attack between, and it's often called this resolution a blank check. You understand what that means? A blank check? It means that you can spend as much money as you want. There's no kind of budgetary limits or constraints. So we call this an example of the elevation of the imperial presidency. So normally when you declare war, who oversees the war itself? Congress. That's their job, is to declare war, right? Well, by doing this resolution, they're not declaring war. So they're just saying, use as many forces as you need. Now, near the end of the Vietnam War, Congress is going to pass another law called the War Powers Act, which basically stops this from being a thing again. But today, presidents routinely start war if they want to. And this is kind of troublesome, I think, certainly in the nature of the presidency. So please be aware of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which is an act of Congress to let Johnson use as much money and resources as he needs to combat communism in Vietnam. And so you're going to see, after the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, the first large buildup of U.S. troop forces, right? You're going to have the first ground battle, and we'll look at this in the Battle of Ya Drang. So I take you back to the election here just to remind you of how popular Johnson was really at that time, and how he's going to go from, it's really an amazing downfall very quickly. How he's going to go from being one of the most popular people in America to one of the least popular people in America in the span of 4 years. So that's a really big, that shows you how, by the way, how we as Americans are willing to change our mind pretty quickly, right? So it's 65, and he has managed to, secure passage of the Civil Rights Act. But Martin Luther King had wanted something else included in the Civil Rights Act, which Johnson said he could not get through Congress. Johnson said, we have to take it out. And so the part that he takes out is the guarantee of voting rights, right? Well, that produces a new round of protest by African-American civil rights leaders. So here's Dr. King on the bridge named Edmund Pettus Bridge. This is from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama march. Okay, 1965, from Selma to Montgomery. And they're marching, demanding voting rights. They're marching on the capital of Alabama, okay? And when they cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, this is what happens to them on national television. Policemen attack them and beat them, as they're coming over the bridge. And one of the guys at the vanguard of the march is this young man here. His name is, and I'd like you to know him, is John Lewis. And John L. Lewis, this is different from, John Lewis is different from John L. Lewis, who we saw before. John Lewis is going to become a congressman and ultimately one of the great long-term figures of the post-civil rights African-American leadership. Okay, so this is John Lewis receiving the Medal of Freedom from President Obama before his death at the age of 80. So he will be hit in the head so bad, he'll be having like blood pouring down his scalp and stuff like down his face on like national TV. He'll be like one of the young men clearly being attacked in this moment. So they're marching, demanding voting rights, and what it does is it catapults that issue into the mainstream again. Publicizing this march and the subsequent beatings is going to raise awareness of the fact that Southern African Americans, particularly, their rights are limited by things like the grandfather clause, the literacy test, that's a big one, poll taxes. So, lots of that discriminatory Jim Crow stuff from the 1870s and 80s and 90s is still in effect, 60 years after. And so Johnson will sort of circle the wagons, crack the whip, so to speak. That's probably a bad metaphor. Beat on Congress. It's called a whip count when you're a U.S. senator and you're trying to get your vote, a whip count. So what happens is he gets Congress together again, and they debate, and stunning, really, a lot of people, they gain passage of two different pieces of legislation. One is the 24th Amendment. The 24th Amendment makes it outlawed for to have poll taxes. Because poll taxes were routinely used in Jim Crow to keep voters from voting. If you have to pay to vote, a lot of people won't do it. Well, whites would have had to pay it, but they were grandfathered. Oh, yeah. Which means if your granddaddy didn't pay a poll tax, you didn't have to either. Yeah, and that's pretty much the truth on all of it, right? So they would word it in a way so that initially it wouldn't say like no black people who voted. It would say like you must pay a poll tax unless, right, because, black people, and it might eliminate some white people, but they usually got out of it. Keep in mind, these were enforced by local voting registrars and local cops, and, so law was kind of, when it came to those guys. All right. So what did the Voting Rights Act do? Which was a huge law too. It eliminated literacy tests, so you get rid of poll taxes and literacy tests. Supervised federal officials would come to elections now. So you're talking about the presence of federal marshals or people from the Federal Elections Commission, and they're making sure. And I don't have it on here, but I should mention this. It also, if you are a southern state, a state that's seceded, you had to submit to the U.S. government, the Justice Department, and the courts. A judge had to approve your redistricting. The boundary districts to make sure you weren't what? Gerrymandering. Very good. You weren't racially dividing so that black people couldn't vote. I want you to know that part of the Voting Rights Act has since been ruled unconstitutional 2 years ago by the Supreme Court because they say it doesn't apply anymore. In other words, 50 years later or 60 years later, we're not like this. So nonetheless, that's no longer the case where a local district, like a congressional district, has to be submitted to a judicial proceeding. But that's 50 some years, 60 years after the fact. So definitely know the Voting Rights Act. But today, that's kind of why you may have read about like congressional districts having to submit their border and then having to redraw it. It happened in Virginia a bunch, and happened in North Carolina a bunch. Because you had what is called racial gerrymandering. And the trick is today, the hard part is that when you gerrymander, which by the way, gerrymandering itself is not illegal. I think it probably should be. I don't think that the government shouldn't, show preferential treatment to anybody. But when you gerrymander today, partisan gerrymandering is legal, is acceptable so far at least, because it's considered part of the political process. The trick is, if you look at states like North Carolina or Virginia, large segments of, let's say, Democratic voters are also African American, and they're concentrated in the same areas. So, if you divide it for partisan purposes, well, you're going to end up dividing it racially. And so it's really a tricky thing. But nonetheless, the greatness of this is that you now finally have the right to vote guaranteed for all people over the age of 21. Okay. Yeah. You guys want to see the case?
I never saw it on the news.
Well, it happens. As I say, when you were 14, were probably not reading too much about Voting Rights Act law, right? So the part of it that was ruled unconstitutional is the part that was covered by section, what does it say, 5, 6? Shelby County is the case. Yeah. So this is the part I'm talking about. If you're curious, and it was a very partisan vote, 5-4. All the Republicans voted one way, all the Dems voted a different way. That's pretty much how it works now. Dems appointed. But today's Voting Rights Act changed under a case called Shelby County, Alabama versus Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General of the United States at the time. These were states that were covered under parts of the Voting Rights Act, and now they no longer have to do that. So you can check that out if you're interested. We certainly will talk about this in AP Gov, but that's the modern part. Now, I do want you to take a look at the blue. The blue is registered African American voters. The red is pre-Voting Rights Act, right? Red is pre-Voting Rights Act. Pay close attention to Mississippi, for example. Alabama, right? Yeah. Well, this is a 695% growth in voting. So the Voting Rights Act had a profound impact on guaranteeing African Americans' right to vote, particularly in the South. Where, keep in mind, what was the major obstacle to voting? Registration, because that's where your literacy test and your poll tax came in, that registration and voting in the case poll tax. But this allowed many more people, and it's also the product of the Freedom Summer. It's the product of the Freedom Riders. The idea of trying to educate people to register to vote. Okay, so this is a major part of the change in African American rights in our country. I don't know. I don't know if they were really expensive. I don't know, honestly. I'll check it out. Average poll tax cost. I don't think they were probably too expensive. It's just the argument goes, What is that? The argument goes that people who don't have much money are not going to pay much money pre-voting. In 1902, Virginia was $1.50. Okay, so that was 1902. So I don't think it was probably extremely high, but keep in mind, if you're a black person voting in the South, your options are choose between this white racist and that white racist, typically, most of the time. There were 3 Southern senators who voted for, 3 Southern senators who voted for either the Civil Rights Act, Southern senators, or the Voting Rights Act. I forget which one it is. Voted for, I think it's Civil Rights Act. Yeah, I can't remember exactly. I'll have to go back and check it out because it was very, very against like the political popular winds of the day to vote in favor of this. But it passed, in the Senate. They overcame the filibuster. So I also remind you of where African Americans were migrating during this period. This is second wave migration, right? So during second wave migration, where are many African Americans migrating? Well, no, I guess that was part of the first great migration. No, now they're migrating west to Seattle, Washington, and Oregon and California. So first wave is kind of northeastern cities and the Rust Belt, Midwest. Second wave is out west, California a lot, because of what was out there. What's out here? What are these things? These are defense industry businesses and bases. So these are defense bases. So if you think about where our bases are in our nation, the naval bases, around them is a lot of military production, right? So if you find these big bright orange dots, think about us. There's the Pentagon, there's Norfolk, and Virginia is a huge beneficiary of military spending, right? So, but all across the South, right?
Wait,
Huh?
when was Area 51?
Area 51?
What year is that?
I don't know when Area 51 was classified as Area 51, like when they decided to make that Area 51. You guys know online? Well, I know that we started out there doing the nukes. I sure did. I did not mean to. Area 51. A51 or something on either. Area 51 started in 1955. Yeah, it was in the Cold War, Ike. It was, yeah. All that stuff out there in New Mexico and Arizona was part of the Air Force. They were doing nuclear tests and alien tests and whatever else tests. So take a look at another way to look at white flight / the Great Migration. Where were whites leaving in huge numbers up there? All across here, right? The industrial Northeast. So whites are leaving here. Either they're moving to the suburbs, that's the red with the yellow dot, or they're leaving altogether, suburbs and city. That's the yellow dot alone. So what this means is routinely, this is what black people moved into. Okay. So when we talk about African-American struggle, the Voting Rights Act, you could probably put an exclamation point, was the last major law to benefit African-Americans writ large, like from historic injustice. And so for many African-Americans, it was still unfinished. The work was still undone. And particularly the number one problem they considered was in housing. So when blacks moved north, remember, there were lots of discriminatory housing policies, right? Redlining, things like that. And we already talked about this once already. So what they had left that they were eligible to move into were housing projects. And unfortunately, under HUD, you had some of the most infamous housing projects developed where the federal government sort of outsourced these to contractors and they built really poorly constructed. The idea was to mass as many people as possible into a small space as possible. So this is the most infamous of all housing projects in American history. This is Cabrini Green in southern Chicago, all right? Cabrini Green today is closed down, but this would become like Baghdad. You understand? I mean, look at these cities. They became, because all the jobs were leaving, right? Who owned the buildings? Oh, Well, we'll pick up with housing and the riots of the 60s tomorrow, okay, and finish up LBJ. So y'all have a good day. And if you didn't take your quiz yet, be sure to take it.